poignant memory came upon me the other day while I was passing the drinking fountain near Holland Park. For there I and my sister had spoken together of our longing for Sligo and our hatred of London. I know we were both very close to tears, and remember with wonder, for I had never known anyone that cared for such mementos, that I longed for a sod of earth from some field I knew, something of Sligo to hold in my hand.
Late in 1881, the family's stay in England came to an end when, under financial pressure, they moved to Howth, a few miles from Dublin. Here were formulated his first aesthetic theories. Between 1884 and 1888, Yeats left boyhood behind. In his growing need for self-assertion and self-expression, his energies sprang forth in many directions.
I had three interests. Interest in a form of literature, in a form of philosophy, and a belief in nationality.
The main influence on him was old John O'Leary, the Fenian hero who returned to Dublin in 1884 after a 20-year exile. O'Leary's nationalism was distinctive in that he had a deep and somewhat discriminating interest in Irish literature. His presence had a considerable effect upon Yeats.
From O'Leary's conversation, and from the Irish books he lent or gave me, has come all I have set my hand to since.
The ultimate purpose of Yeats's use of nationality in verse was, paradoxically, to enable him to transcend it. He begins, like Stephen Dedalus, with his home, his village, and his nation, and ends with the universe.
Well, I think people recognized that a force had been dropped into the middle of the pool and the ripples were starting. Young Yeats had an immense ambition, and it wasn't that he was overbearing. He was immensely concentrated, and I think this is what, at every moment of his life, at every moment of every day of his life, there was a unified purpose and a sense of driven but very human energy. So from the beginning, I think people sensed a project, a pressure, and an energy that meant business.
Maybe a 12 months since, suddenly I began, in scorn of this audience, imagining a man and his sun-freckled face and grey Connemara cloth, climbing up to a place where stone is dark under froth, the downturn of his wrist when the flies drop in the stream. A man who does not exist, a man who is but a dream, cried, "Before I am old, I shall have written him one poem, maybe as cold and passionate as the dawn."
For a while he felt that to be a poet one had to look like a poet, and looking like a poet in the late 19th century really involved this kind of languid appearance, long flowing locks of hair, flowing cloak, bow tie and so on. And he looked therefore what he thought ought to be the image.
Dressing up as a poet was probably a form of self-defense, possibly a kind of mask. Presentation of himself to the world as a poet, and take it or leave it. But I am a poet, sort of thing.
By early 1886, Yeats was both nationalist and occultist. In the year of his coming of age in the legal sense, he came of age poetically as well.
His chosen comrades thought at school he must grow a famous man. He thought the same and lived by rule, all his 20s crammed with toil. What then, sang Plato's ghost? What then?
Yeats at first testified to a hostility for the life of big cities, especially London. But with another part of his mind, he saw that the city might be useful to him in ways that the country would not. When he was 22, he went again to live with his family in London. There he joined the circle of Madame Blavatsky. He met young and highly polished English poets. He found publishers. Besides Madame Blavatsky and her extraordinary converts, the world of letters boasted individualists as remarkable as Oscar Wilde and William Morris and a host of others. This gave London, under Victoria, a literary atmosphere which it lost under the Edwardians. But to a poor Irishman, longing for recognition, it seemed alien and hostile. His family was very badly off, sometimes even hungry.
It must have been an interesting household with Jack Yeats and William Yeats and Elizabeth Yeats and Lily Yeats, all very different people in the same house.
I should think it must have been slightly tense always. There were tensions between my father and his sisters and so on. It was a very strong-willed family. It was a wonderful house, I should think, for my father, the poet, and my uncle, the artist, Jack Yeats. A wonderful house to grow up in, provided you weren't interested in the ordinary practical things of life. In other words, to use the modern term, my grandfather was a very bad provider, but in many ways he was a very good father for an artistic family of that kind.
So you had 3 mini volcanoes, I suppose you might say, in the house, all determined not to lose ground. There must have been a great deal of intellectual excitement in the house, not to mention friction.
I was 23 years old when the troubling of my life began. I had never thought to see in a living woman so great beauty. It belonged to famous pictures, to poetry, to some legendary past.
On the 30th of January, 1889, Maud Gonne knocked on the door of the family's house. Yeats immediately fell in love.
He looked much younger than I did, because he was rather a disheveled art student. John O'Leary used to say, your vocation is to be a poet. You have that in you. And then he would make him read some of his early poems.
Had I the heavens' embroidered cloths, enwrought with golden and silver light, the blue and the dim and the dark cloths of night and light and the half-light, I would spread the cloths under your feet. But I, being poor, have only my dreams. I have spread my dreams under your feet. Tread softly, because you tread on my dreams.
She came visiting at the family home in Bedford Park. She'd been sent over by the old Fenian John O'Leary, whom my father knew well at the time. And so she stayed for an afternoon and talked most of the time to my father and to John Butler Yeats, his father. And then that night they had dinner together, and from then on my father was really fascinated by her.
Yes, and he was very young when he met her. He had nothing to measure her against. To meet Maud Gonne at 23 would certainly calculate it to disturb you, to say the least of it. She was, after all, very beautiful. She was very good to look at. Disastrously attractive in many ways. I think she made him very unhappy, and probably just enough happiness to make him want to continue loving her. Well, I think there's no doubt. I think you don't make poems like he made without having some tremendous upheaval inside you.
The greatness of the poems is a reflection of his personal suffering over the whole thing. He was constantly thinking about her, I think, for a number of years. To the end of her days, of course, she was essentially a revolutionary. The cause was everything, and the means were perhaps immaterial.
Why should I blame her that she filled my days with misery, or that she would of late have taught to ignorant men most violent ways, or hurled the little streets upon the great, had they but courage equal to desire? What could have made her peaceful, with a mind that nobleness made simple as a fire, with beauty like a tightened bow, a kind that is not natural in an age like this, being high and solitary and most stern? Why, what could she have done, being what she is? Was there another Troy for her to burn?
I think poets perhaps tend to write poems more about unsuccessful love than successful. So there's a great deal about Maud Gonne in his poems, but you won't find Mrs. W.B. Yeats.
From then on, Yeats's life and everything he did was coloured by his love for Maud Gonne. To win her, he would have to be the man of action, organising and building for Ireland. A literary movement could have had little hope of arousing popular enthusiasm when Parnell was at the height of his power.
Resign!
Accused of adultery, he lost the leadership of the Irish party. On his death, a year later, Yeats hastily wrote a poem, Mourn and then Onward. He seems to have grasped instinctively that the time had come for him to act.
The new situation created by the fall of Parnell was that there was in Dublin City a centre, a city which was resistant to clerical power, to the Catholic clergy. And in that city, for that time, and we're speaking now of the period roughly 1891 to 1900, there was a welcome and an audience for intelligent, upwardly mobile Protestant Parnellites. And Yeats seized that opening. He was moving, in a sense, to assume as an artist something of Parnell's mental, and he was quite conscious of that objective.
Preferring poetry to politics, Yeats conceived a type of literary nationalism.
It was felt simply by my father and his compatriots that it was necessary to have a new literature created so that a new Ireland could emerge, because it was felt very strongly that you couldn't have a sense of nationality without literature, and vice versa.
Coole Park, County Galway, was the home of Lady Gregory, a 45-year-old widow whose interest in Irish folk tales had been inflamed by a reading of the Celtic Twilight.
He used to spend quite a long time in the west of Ireland with Lady Gregory, who had a house and land, Coole Park, and she used to make him welcome, and he used to stay with her for quite long periods.
I doubt if I should have done much with my life, but for her firmness and her care. If that influence were lacking, Ireland would be greatly impoverished. So much has been planned out in the library or among the woods at Coole. We work to add dignity to Ireland, was a favourite phrase of hers.